Okay, cool. I can put it up.
And if anyone has any questions while Kaushik is speaking, you guys can messages in the chat to everyone or just private message me, and I'll be monitoring that, and we'll kind of have an open Q&A thing at the end.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Paul. I think on that note, then I will say I've opened up the Google Docs. I've seen a bunch of people already signed up, and also I will add, a bunch of you guys have asked if you can connect with me on LinkedIn, like, and a bunch of you already have, so feel free to. I put that up, as well as another way to find on Instagram at Elevate Career. So feel free, and I will try to kind of answer kind of a lot of questions offline and stuff like that. So let's maybe go to I think you kind of asked about the background, so we'll start there. A little bit about myself. I've spent the last 8 years sort of in investment banking and private equity. So I started out at Goldman in our financial institutions investment banking group. So this is right out of the last crisis, and I'll talk you guys a little bit through, kind of what I saw and the opportunities that I saw coming out of the last crisis as we're kind of going through one right now. And then so I started in financial services. I think there I really was fortunate in investment banking. Early on in my career as an associate, I got to lead what ended up being the 3 of the biggest deals ever, ever in FIG. So that was the $3 billion IPO of Synchrony, the sort of $50 billion M&A divestiture of GE Capital in the US, and then the overall like $100 billion divestiture of GE Capital as a whole globally. So Goldman was kind of leading all those transactions, and I was just right place, right time, got to work on all those transactions. So for me, that was very formative early on in my career, not just in terms of an amazing learning experience, but also working with some of the senior most partners at the firm. Like I got to present to management committee, and all those cool things. I think those are just some opportunities that I had early on, as well as I think, set yourself for success over your career. So I think one takeaway from that is just, being open to these crazy opportunities that could come up and then taking advantage of them when you do. Then I transitioned to the buy side. I joined Goldman's own private equity group, which is a PIA function, which is called PIA, but it's in our merchant bank. That's traditional large cap mega fund buyouts. So we were doing that. I made principal there and pretty early on. And then after that, I joined another fund, Varde, as a director to help build out their global PE business. So a lot of that time was spent sort of building out private equity for us internationally. So I was in Asia in 2019, set up our Asia operations, and then also in the US. So that was super, super cool to be part of, that has been super cool to be a part of that. And then one thing I'll highlight, I think one thing that was consistent throughout that was sort of, I really was interested in leadership, people development, recruiting, and some of those things. So as a result, I got to take on a lot of leadership roles at Goldman. So I was kind of chief of staff within our investment banking group in FIG. I led our recruiting committees and other sorts of committees like that, which sort of leads me to the overview that Paul asked about for Elevate. So we founded Elevate last year, and the whole premise is to provide sort of what I think is really missing, which is high quality resources, recruiting, training, and networking opportunities for professionals and students in the business, finance, and investing world. So the ways I've done that, or we've done that, is one, we've partnered up with professionals from the top sort of 50 private equity firms, investment banks, VC funds, et cetera. And then on the other side, we're partnering up with sort of the top undergrad, as well as grad schools, as far as kind of the network itself, right? So we'll kind of get into that for a second. And I think how I think about Elevate for you guys that are interested, on the professional side, I think you'll be hard pressed to find anything out there that has sort of the professional network that we've been able to do within the last year, as far as bringing in speakers, bringing sort of advice, resources, and just mentorship from professionals from the top firms in the world. So I think I'm super proud of that. A lot of that's kind of driven by some of the relationships that I've been able to build over my career. And then on the school side, I think Paula and I were talking about, we've sort of been able to establish the partnerships as well as collaborations across the top sort of investment groups and finance clubs across the country. So I'm super proud of that over the last sort of 8 months or so. So that's on the advice side. I think on the training side, Paula, we'll send some information for you guys, but we wanted to create sort of training that would be like the best in class training that we could provide for some of these careers. So we've done that sort of in banking, in PE and VC. And the goal was to bring in professionals from the industry to really teach everyone what seems to be opaque careers, as well as kind of things that you need to know or you can learn from other people who've been successful through these careers. So it's really important for you to bring in sort of director, partner, principal level people from the top firms in the world, again, to provide this training. So we've done that in banking comprehensively, in private equity, same thing, kind of some of the top firms in the world. Now we're working on something in VC where we partnered up with sort of 5 or so managing partners from a lot of the VCs in Silicon Valley to help present that. The third thing is networking. We're working on this, and Paul Levin and Shibum, we're working on this, but to sort of do cross-school networking on a one-on-one basis across all my different universities. More information to come on that, but just kind of keep your eyes out for that on the fall. And then finally on recruiting, we're working with private equity firms, banks, et cetera, to help better find opportunities for a lot of our Elevate members to sort of go there. Because I think on the recruiting side, there's a lot of, having done this and seen this at GS and other places, there's kind of a lot of things that are broken. So that's my quick summary of Elevate. And we can go from there if people have any questions. Like I mentioned, you guys can, you can sign up for more info in there and you'll get access. And we're also doing, I mentioned Apollo before, we're doing 4 panels, probably 3 or 4 panels in October, which will be with, again, the professionals. So we're going to try to do these live again, and hopefully, people can participate, ask questions, and so on and so forth. So I'll pause there. You guys can ask any questions.
Feel free to type in the chat or just raise your hand in the participants tab. I'll be monitoring that. Kaushik, one just question I had about your background, I guess. I know you mentioned you worked in GS in like their private equity group. So is that a segment of like the overall like merchant banking group, and is that different from like the growth equity team? Yeah,
so that's a good question. So we've reorged it a few different ways over the years, but effectively like the private equity group sits within bank, which the goal of that is to run sort of principal investing into companies. And there's 2 big segments. There's on the equity side, which is either large scale buyouts, which is where I sat in, kind of the mega fund buyout land, or there's sort of, you kind of go down the stream, growth equity, where, our folks out in San Francisco, they work on making investments into growth type companies. So like long ago, folks like Uber, if they're doing like Series B, Series C, Series D, some of those companies invested in the past. That's where our growth equity sits, so sort of in the middle. So it's all kind of sits into the principal business. And then we also have a principal business. So effectively, like think about, if you're doing a transaction and you need debt for that transaction, Goldman would also provide debt from a creditor perspective, right? And I know some of this stuff sounds a little, people don't really know the difference. I'm happy to let me go into just one more level of detail. Like on the equity side, the goal is to take majority, like you're looking at one end of the spectrum, what private equity is, you're looking to take majority control investment into a company such that you can own it for a distinct period of time, and then you can help run it as an operational component as well. And then over the course of 4 to 5 years, improve operations, and improve the growth trajectory of the company such that in 4 to 5 years, you're in a position to sell it and make sort of a 25%-ish return, yearly IRR return kind of call. So that's kind of the private equity piece. The credit piece is more of, hey, we will provide you like credit or debt against some sort of a transaction that's going on, and then our rate of return, depending on the riskiness of that transaction, where we go in the capital stack, it's going to be somewhere from like 8, 9, 10% up to like 15ish%, and then we'll have more of a security interest because we're a debtor basically. So that's the 2 parts of the business, and growth equity is kind of in the middle, in that it's a non-control stake, right? So you're taking you're taking like 10, 20% of the business potentially with other investors, and then the goal is you are sort of like a bench seat so that you can see this thing grow over the next 3 to 4 years and then exit out during an IPO or an M&A transaction, right? So that's sort of how I think about the lay of the land between PE growth and debt, like credit side.
Yeah, no, that's super helpful. And for anyone else who has like questions about that, feel free to type it in the chat and we'll try to address it later on. I see, Will, you have your hand raised.
Yeah. Thanks, Kaushik. That was a really great intro. And it's really cool to see your background and all the great things that you've done. My question, so I noticed that you went to the University of Chicago for your MBA. My question has to do with sort of what you sort of see, especially in the upper tier and maybe in the buy side as well, with that recognition of the MBA sort of in today's landscape, as well as, is it something that you recommend for a lot of us?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I get this question asked probably like my top 10 questions on all campuses. And I think it's a really important question to just think about, and the answer that I would give to everyone would be individually different, but I think my view on an MBA is as follows. One is you kind of, I think it's actually a great place holistically if you kind of know what you want to get out of it, right? So I think that's the one really big important thing. On the more practical side, I'd probably start by saying, for a lot of you guys, let's leave the 2+2 option aside for one sec. I think you will have sort of 2 to 3 years once you start working to really determine for your own self if you want to go get an MBA, right? So I would really kind of overweight that part of your career, your kind of the first 2 to 3 years of your career, to see if you really think you need to go get an MBA. So that's one thing. So is the MBA the right decision for you? Then the question is like, all right, so what are the buckets of people that get the MBA is actually beneficial for? And I would say probably a couple different things. One is some firms kind of ask you to get an MBA. So a lot of the consulting firms sort of ask you to go get an MBA. Some of the banks used to do that. A lot of the banks in banking don't do that much anymore. A lot of the private equity firms still make you do that. So if you go into private equity, you kind of, I think I would say about 75 to 80% of them still want you to, again, you get to that principal level, want you to go get an MBA. So the trajectory there might look like going in banking, then go to private equity, then go get an MBA, which is like the vast majority of my analysts from GS are going through that right now. And then go back and recruit for private equity. But then like VC and all these other careers are very different. So a lot of the answer to your question on the MBA sort of depends on what you want to get out of it. Mm-hmm. And then the third kind of lens I would put on this is the people that I know that have gotten the most out of an MBA probably fall into 3 buckets. One is those that need it for their careers. That's advancement, right? So private equity, consulting, banking kind of, VC kind of, or management. I think it's really important, right? So I think that one thing is still there. Number 2, people who want to switch, right? So let's say you start in consulting or you start in public equities and want to make the switch to private equity, or you want to kind of make the switch from the sell side to the buy side or whatever. I think there you can actually add a lot of value. So for me, that was a case in point. I started in consulting actually coming out of the last crisis. For me, I wanted to kind of make the switch over to M&A. And so for me, that was like a good transition. And I think the third thing is just people who are maybe more entrepreneurial and want to build out a lot of the other skill sets. So let's say you start your career out in like consulting, or you start out in like finance, but you want to go start your own company. A lot of people want to build out that skill set around, hey, I want to learn how to do sales and marketing. I want to learn how to operations. I want to learn how to do finance. I want to learn all these other things and develop a lot of the network, right? So I think that for that reason, it becomes really important. So if you sort of fit in one of those 3 buckets, I would say go for it. I also think roughly like there's a cachet, I think, for the top 10-ish MBA programs. I'm curious, and actually I'm on the fence about in the next 5 years, what might happen to the MBA. Look, I think the top 7, 8 programs will probably still be there. I think, the value of it is has gone down, especially with the pandemic now, right? I think you're seeing a lot of this, but I think more so, I still see it retaining value if you go to kind of a top school, because at the end of the day, like, the job market and everything's so competitive, people want to see some level of credentialization, right? So I think whether it's your undergrad, whether it's the firm you go to, whatever, I think for me, Chicago or Goldman, those are good ways to like credentialize yourself anytime you go out somewhere, right? So I think for that reason, yes. To be honest, a lot of the stuff we're building out with Elevate, frankly, like could over time, like overtake some of that, right? So think about the networking component. We're already kind of building out a large networking component. Think about the recruiting component. We're already sort of building that out. The training component, we're already building out from a practical perspective. So look, it's a big investment. So definitely consider that. It's an individual decision at the end of the day. You should probably defer on that decision for a couple years out. I do think it was one of the greatest times of my life. So if you guys want to like think about 2 years of just, getting to meet amazing people, sure. But understand that, and I was young, let me tell you the other thing, I was probably one of the youngest people in my class. So I'd probably say there's pros and cons of doing that early also. So I think, kind of think about when you want to do it, if you're going to do it as well. And if it's the right thing for you to do for your career. Is that helpful?
Okay. Yeah, I had a quick follow-up question. How does, say, for example, like another type of master's program stack up to that? Like, let's say like a PhD in economics, or like a master's in economics, or maybe even financial engineering.
Yeah, so good question. So I think, look, sort of depends on what your end goal is, right? So I've always kind of said, if you want to go into like sort of the front office jobs, and I'm not taking into consideration like the quant trading or the super techie type things, which require PhDs and stuff. But if you want to sort of go to the front office jobs, I've always overvalued or valued more practical experience to sort of academic experience, right? So to me, another year of getting a master's, like unless there's a distinct story there, or you're kind of the job market tanked, like, when you were graduating or whatever, giving you a leg up, I think people in the industry, myself included, and I can say this with some level of authority, I think we just generally like an additional year of work versus an additional year of this. So in the finance, consulting, business world, I haven't seen it add that much value. Like, frankly, like I think you're better off taking some of these master classes in your undergrad, because I'm always just like, let's get out and get some experiences. So which is why I'm a huge fan of like, in school year internships or like summer internships, et cetera, because you could be in like academic programs forever, but if you want to make that transition to like the professional world, I think the experience side of it matters a lot more. That said, I think so. I had on like quants from Citadel on my platform on Elevate, and I think in that field you need more of this PhD, sort of master's technical backgrounds, because they're doing some crazy stuff. So I think for that, for some of these jobs you do need it, but for the vast majority of them, I haven't personally seen yet that you really have needed it. In fact, I think it actually sets you back because it throws you off the recruiting path that like a lot of firms have, like a undergrad to recruiting to master's type of thing, that it might actually throw you off that path.
Okay, thanks so much.
Yeah, sure.
I think Sam, you had your hand raised.
Yeah, thanks so much for all the information. I have a quick question. You mentioned that through Elevate, you've noticed a lot of loopholes in the recruiting process, and I'm curious to like know what some of those loopholes are and how they may differ from a big corporation like Goldman Sachs to like maybe a smaller like boutique VC.
Yeah, look, it's a good question. And so kind of taking you behind the scenes a little bit, look, I think for some of the kind of interesting, quite the main pain points or just loopholes, as you put it, I think like the on the middle market side, I think when you start thinking about middle market private equity, middle market venture capital, hedge funds, even investment banks, I think the challenges that they have really is the ability to recruit with any sort of earnest, across a talented pool of candidates. Oftentimes, kind of what they do is they go to like NYU or they go to Columbia or they go to Wharton, and literally they just literally have the bandwidth to go to like one school, and then they kind of get the people there. And that challenges over time has been, it's a lot of like, oh hey, I know of someone or I know someone in the family that does this, and they don't end up getting sort of what I feel like is a very meritocratic way to get the best candidates that are out there. The other challenge with just going to one or two schools, I think frankly, is you may not be, you may get like the 50th best or 100th best candidate at a certain school because, they're already going somewhere else. So it's been a lot of like visibility problems, for that kind of the middle market, upper middle market space, which is where I think somewhere like Elevate's been really, really additive in terms of value for them, because we see across all these different. I think on the student side, look, I think as much as you try, it sometimes becomes about connections, like who like family, like all these other things. And I'm not sure that's, again, the most meritocratic way to like kind of get people in front of opportunities. I think there's still a huge supply-demand imbalance in terms of really good funds looking for people and then really good candidates, and it's kind of not being met. And then when can I take it up to like the larger firms, like the large banks or even large private equity firms where we're doing a lot of work with them on, it often ends up being like recruiters, for instance, almost like our middlemen or headhunters, but they're not the most sort of, they don't have full knowledge of like the finance role itself. And so as a result are not able to like do a great job of delineating between candidates. And I think the second problem for that space, honestly, is, look, as much as you like it, I think a 30-minute interview or whatever is great, but I think it's just having more data points for people is always helpful. So I think with the Elevate platform, with all the different data points that we might be able to gather on people, whether it's, working with student leaders or working with you guys specifically, I think we're able to overcome a lot of those things. So I would say sort of one is on the visibility side, one is on the reach, so visibility of the firm itself, one is on reach and access to strong candidate across an array of schools. Number three is around sourcing, right? So how do you go and kind of get the best candidates? Because if even like GS, we would put something up and then we get 500 resumes from a certain school. Like how do you go from 500 to 30, right? I think it's a very haphazard process. And then on the evaluation side, we're working with them, just given some of the data points. And then finally, I think with COVID, a lot of firms are like, hey, we don't have avenue to like get in front of candidates and really talk about our differentiators. And I think, again, that platform allows us to do that. So I'm happy to go into much more detail beyond that, but I felt like some of the track record that we've had already is able to address all those points. And I think on the student side, it's like giving them access to high quality, like, relationships. And the business groups and clubs I'm partnered up with, we've also chosen very carefully as being, you know, very strong groups on campus. So I think there's a little bit of, we're getting quality in it. So it's all about quality, I think, when it comes to recruiting, not like, can you get 1,000 candidates in the door? Can you get like 30 really good candidates? Because a lot of my PE firms that I'm working with on the recruiting side, like they don't want to see 100 candidates. They want to see 30 really good candidates. So I think that's just one thing I'll say. I think it's a good question. Happy to go into a lot more detail, but it's really like something that I think is sort of stuck in the 90s, and I think needs to kind of be where. And the last thing is on diversity. I think that's a huge hole that, you know, we're partnered up with I'd say like so many different women in business groups and you know, like minorities in business groups, et cetera. And it's sort of like, unfortunately, the way we are in the world. But I would like to think kind of, I love the representation already in BIG. Like the great thing about Elevate is all of our groups, you know, BIG or, you know, Duke Investment Club or some of these clubs, they already have a very good representation of diversity. And so for me, that's really, really important, you know, versus the traditional ways is like who you know versus, you know, how much you know or how good of a candidate you are, right? So I think that's another thing that's another thing I think we try to do differently than others. But I'd love to get you guys' feedback, you know, on the recruiting stuff. If you guys have questions, and I'm happy to answer any other questions on that. But it's super exciting, I think, as an array for Elevate. But anyway, that's a good question.
Yeah, 100%. Thank you. I think even like in BIG, we've kind of seen that like on like maybe a microcosm scale. When we attract people with different majors or different backgrounds, the like diversity of thought in our fund dramatically improves, which is kind of an obvious statement, but I for sure think that that's lacking in the recruiting world. And
yeah,
corporations like Goldman Sachs are realizing that, I feel like now. They're like, you know, hitting those quotas for diversity, which is great, but I'm not sure how well it's going, but.
Yeah, and I think, look, at the end of the day, I think it's such a personal thing, right? In other words, like every candidate, to me, like I think we all should say this or think about this, but, you know, we try, at least everything that, because we were trying to do, or even generally in the world is like, you know, you building your own network, right? I think whatever the affinity is, I think you should go and do that with the most earnest that you can, right? So those are, at the end of the day, those relationships, whether it's a man or a woman or, you know, whatever, I think to your point, I think those are the ones that kind of lead you to there. One of the challenges that I've seen, frankly, whether it's diversity or non-diversity, is I think people aren't getting there enough to network. And I think that could overcome a lot of these challenges to help people understand and get to know people on a personal level beyond a resume or kind of beyond something else. So I would just encourage you guys, regardless of what your, you know, affinity or whatever your, you know, anything is, I think the networking is just something that I've just felt is so important to be helpful in my own career that I think people underutilize, to be honest, even still, because we're so caught up in the day-to-days of, you know, study groups and homework. I think all that stuff is really important. I think getting grades is important. I think what's even more important in your career is going to be the relationships that you're developing. The best time to do that is now. You know, your best time to do that is in college when there's, you know, very little like risk to doing that. So it's a good question, Sept.
I think, so we're going to take one more quick question here. And then after that, we can start to get into more about Kaushik's like actual deal experience and some of his experiences, I guess, more in detail, just in the interest of like progressing the conversation forward. So Marissa, do you have a question?
Yeah, I do. Sorry, I apologize if this is like a little off topic, but I'm really interested in like your work back at Goldman Sachs when you worked on the IPO for Synchrony Financial. I'm really like interested to like listen to about your experiences in that, or like maybe what your what the most interesting part of that work was, and perhaps if you can feed in like some advice for how college students can get experience in that field.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think given the state of the equity markets right now, especially in technology, I think that's a fantastic question. One, I will thank you guys, all of you guys that have filled in this sheet. Feel free to do so if you haven't yet. And again, like I mentioned, you could feel free to ask me any follow-ups. I think Paula mentioned we made a wrap-up Q&A. So if you have further questions, feel free to add me on LinkedIn, as a lot of you guys already have. I'm happy to answer it there. I think the question on the IPO is really interesting. So I almost lucked into this deal. So I think when you think about an IPO, it could kind of happen in probably one of two different ways, right? One is if a company is part of a larger entity and then it's sort of spinning off and sort of becoming its own entity. So that's one example of an IPO, which is the one that Synchrony was in. Another example is a company that's obviously like a startup that's going to raise capital, in the markets, right? So I think that's a more traditional sort of thing from IPO. Regardless of that scenario, the coolest part of the IPO, notwithstanding the fact that I think the Synchrony IPO was the largest since Facebook, if I remember right. So that was like a big IPO for Goldman as a whole. So it put all this extra like, visibility on the actual IPO. But the way to think about an IPO is you're working with the company to help it sort of go from what is the private domain to the public domain. And there's just so many things that the company almost needs to grow up now, because for instance, the management is now going to be facing real investors, retail investors, your BlackRocks and your Fidelities and your Vanguards of the world, and on that side. So I think those are just much more sophisticated investors. And it's sort of now you're going public, right? So the work, I'll break it down into three things. One is the nature of the work is effectively you're literally, as I was as an associate who was leading that, working with management sort of hand in hand on every single part of the business to make sure it is ready to be a public entity. So everything from its financials, so standalone financials, getting it from whatever it was doing before to now being SEC ready, to the governance of the company. So you need to put in risk mitigants, the board, et cetera. And then most important part of it is telling the story, right? So how do you tell the story of a Synchrony Financial or an Uber or, I don't know, or a Tesla, right? To the whole world, such that you get everyone excited about the business, right? So there is a little bit of like salesmanship and marketing that's involved in addition to all the financial stuff, right? So you're effectively putting together sort of this pitch to the market saying, hey, this is an amazing company that we're going public. This is why you guys need to buy it, or invest in the company. This is what the growth looks like. This is the next 5 years. This is why the industry is awesome. This is why we are the best in this company. So in some sense, you get so deep into a company, much more than even like a sell side. I think you would say kind of buy sides and IPO. Buy sides are probably the most, and then the IPOs, you just get so detailed into the actual company that I really enjoyed kind of getting to know the team and to do that. Number two, I would say, is sort of the so the one is like the deep understanding of the company. Number two, what I really enjoyed is actually getting exposure to the capital market side of the world, right? When you're working in traditional investment banking, like classic side, you're sitting kind of in the M&A side. You're only really interacting with perhaps other industry groups or other, M&A people. What the IPO or the, capital markets transactions do is really you work hand in hand sort of with the ECM team. So we call it ECM, but effectively within banking, there's a capital markets division, which is equity capital markets, debt capital markets, and leveraged finance. And then within equity capital markets, you work with those teams in a lot of detail, because those people are the face to, the investors at the end of it. So if Vanguard or Fidelity or BlackRock want to buy into this company as an IPO, those investors are kind of coming to our ECM team and saying, hey, why should we do this, right? So it sort of kind of takes you from the supply side to the actual demand side of the equation. So if someone wants to buy, and especially some of these, offerings that are oversubscribed, you're sitting here trying to figure out who should be getting allocations and how and whatever. And I think the pricing mechanism is so cool, because you set a price, and based on, you set a range usually in an IPO. So you say, let's say it's like $20 to $22 of a range, and you're going, you're raising $3 billion. And so, if then you go for a week, you go on the road and you present, there's called a road show, you present the company, and if there's a lot of interest, then a lot of people want to buy it at $21, $22, $23 a share. There's not as much interest, it's going to price at the lower end of the range. So there's this whole supply demand dynamic as well that you need to really balance. And then the last thing I would say that's really cool is you get to develop really good relationships with senior people at the management side, right? So I think as a result, it was just a really cool experience for me leading that. So I would say if you guys go into banking, try to get to work on an IPO if you can. It's just a cool experience to try to launch a company from the ground up.
Yeah, I mean, follow-up question, all that sounds really interesting to me, and I think that's definitely something I want to pursue career-wise. But I know that there's a lot of different actors in that field, from accounting to legal. So what internship should I be recruiting for that I can get my hands on that kind of project, but simultaneously being able to touch all the sides?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think, and by the way, what year are you? Are you a sophomore or freshman? Or
I am a sophomore.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so I think the one thing about sort of the land of the IPOs and capital markets is like, even if you go into M&A or even if you go into investment banking, you may not be guaranteed that you're going to work on an IPO. Like if you go work in a TMT group or a tech group in some of our Menlo or San Francisco offices, I think there you're probably a little bit more guaranteed that you'll get to work on an IPO. I think, so that's one thing. You may not be guaranteed to work on an IPO. The second thing is I would kind of maybe start a little bit differently and start maybe getting some experiences on specific industry groups. So maybe like healthcare, IT, technology. Those are two groups where tends to be a lot of sort of, technology is the number one area where there's a lot of IPOs. I would sort of maybe try to get an experience in that industry as opposed to any particular function, such that you're in a position then to recruit for investment banking or ECM, your next year for your junior year or, end of your sophomore year. There you can say, hey, I'm really interested in technology or healthcare IT because I've been working in XY, these type of companies. So like, can you like place me there? So usually like most offices are, you guys are in Berkeley, so you have a lot more people go to the San Francisco office for tech side, but I would probably venture to say get sort of an industry experience versus any sort of functional experience, because I wouldn't necessarily say just because you have an accounting role or you have sort of like an operational role that would make you anyway distinctively to like working on IP or ECM stuff. So I would just say still target getting an investment banking internship and then get some other internship that'll lead you up to that without any specific focus on any sort of industry. I think the biggest thing you do to convince the firm that you want to work in tech, and the way you do that is by demonstrating like an understanding and interest in tech versus any specific function.
Gotcha. Thank you so much.
You got it.
So I think we can switch to some of the questions that I think more generally speak about your experience. So are there any kind of stories, I guess, from your early days at Goldman and the investment banking division that you think would kind of be helpful for us to learn from?
Oh my God, yeah. So I know this is sort of, I would say a couple of things. What I think I've enjoyed, and just, can I just get a raise of hands? There's 35-ish of you guys. I know I'm sure across a lot of different groups. I would say, how many of you, roughly, maybe Shubham or Paul, you guys can answer this, are looking at banking versus investing, maybe versus consulting? Do we know that yet, Shubham? I don't know.
So I think majority is like, around like 2/3 tend to apply for banking, while the rest tend to go towards investing. I don't think anyone is prone towards going for consulting in the Berkeley investment group.
Okay.
And Kaushik, just one thing for context I would add there is a lot of our members apply to both banking roles as well as like private equity roles and stuff on the buy side. Just like the differences in the recruitment timeline may like dictate which they go into. I
got you. Okay, so that makes sense. So we can get to some of that later. If and as relevant. I think the question around sort of some of the early stuff at GS. Look, I would say when you just kind of think of recruiting though, before even kind of you get to GS, I would say it's very competitive, right? So some of you guys are probably thinking, how do you position yourself in a way where you can get that, right? I would say, I would probably give you 3 big pieces of advice. Number one is start networking, right? So, and again, I don't love using that term as a whole, but what I mean by that is start reaching out to people, where it could be Berkeley alums or other people, where you can, you can sort of start developing some of these relationships at some of these banks and firms that'll help you in the recruiting process, or assuming you are sophomores or juniors, kind of doing that. It's number one. Number two, I would say start building a set of experiences that are ancillary related to finance that, you guys can sort of benefit from. So I would say that's number two. And then I think number three is really understand for yourself, like if you want to do banking or investing, and sort of why. This is another popular question I get asked a lot. Should I start out my career in banking? But if I know I want to go into investing, should I just go in there right away? And I have a whole answer for that, which we can get to. But sort of figure out for yourself, what is your plan A, what's your plan B, and really go at it hard. And because I think one thing I know about Berkeley is there isn't as many students at Berkeley that are gung-ho about finance versus like some of my other schools. So that's actually a positive for you guys, because it may not be as competitive as you guys might think, right? So I think if 25, 30, 40 of you guys are reaching out to people, it's a little bit easier for Berkeley to reach, to connect with you, versus I have 400 people from Wharton that are reaching out to all the alums, you know, on the street, right? So I think it's just sort of a position that you're in. So I would just encourage you to go all out and really kind of make those connections as possible. As far as my early days, like I think the thing about your early part of something like an investment banking, for me was just the biggest advice I think I can give you guys is the first 6 months or 8 months are just gonna be the hardest thing. It was for me, at least, coming from a non-finance background, probably the hardest thing I've ever done in my life, just from in terms of like the caliber and the complexity of the deals we're working on. Everyone around you, I feel like the partners at GS were just so smart. There was meetings I'd go to that I'd be like, 40 minutes just went by. I have no idea what this person said. You know what I mean? So like, it was so hard to kind of come over that learning curve. I'll be honest with you. So kind of every day working at it and try to like decompose, taking a bunch of notes, asking questions, but also figuring out for yourself and kind of how to work with that. So I would say that it was really, really challenging. I think the flip side though, when you're in banking early on, even at a junior level, you're working on transactions that are very, very critical for the client. So every meeting that you're doing is for a CFO, CEO, board, right? So you're kind of put feet to the fire and you're the analyst or associate that's running the model. So it's like, you know, a lot of stress, but it's also cool to see at the end. And then the third thing is, I come back to this, you get to work with a lot of really cool people. That's build a really good relationship. So I think for me, that was super cool at GS because I still keep in touch with all the people that I work with, and they've all gone on to do great things, right? So I think that's another kind of huge positive for me. So I'll pause there and kind of we can go from there.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful. And I think transitioning from that, would you be able to kind of provide some of the specifics in terms of deal experience that you've worked on? Anything in particular that you'd kind of like to highlight or walk us through? Yeah,
I guess I'll do two. Since I already covered the IPO of Synchrony, I'll do the divestiture of G Capital. So that was a deal where it was again probably the largest deal ever in financial services, if I think about it. You know, kind of coming off post crisis, and again, it was right place, right time. I was kind of the lead associate there. And that was basically what we were tasked with. Is GE had built up this $500 billion GE Capital business through the crisis under Jack Welch. And then I think through the crisis, there was a lot of credit issues in the business. So as a result, it was impacting the performance of the parent. And so we were tasked to kind of sell that business. So that was a global business that was sort of hundreds of billions of dollars across the whole world. So kind of thinking the complexity of these businesses at that level is insane and immense. And so that was super cool to work on that. It was really intense. I think we had 4 analysts that were under me on that team. And it was just like such a crazy experience just because there's so much going on, like, you know, North America, Canada, Asia, Europe. So that was a really cool experience there. And then the second deal I'll kind of point to a little bit is some of the private equity where I had to go to Asia and sort of set up that business from the ground up. And I think that from an entrepreneurial sense is really, really interesting because kind of to do that in a new geography, working on sourcing, working on deal, you know, work all the different partnerships with different, you know, investment banks and consulting firms, et cetera, on the private equity side, that was super, super challenging for me. And also kind of being tasked to do that at like, you know, sort of at my age, it was just like, hey, everyone you're working with is 2 times as old as you, right? So I think you have to sort of figure out how to add value and really, really stand out, I think, and have people trust you that kind of, you know what you're doing. And that was another really interesting thing in sort of a new geographical experience. And so, yeah, those are just 2 things that stick out to me kind of over my career.
Will, do you have a question?
Yeah, sure. So sorry to deviate away from the deal experience again. I have like a advice question. I was wondering, I guess for all of us college students, like when we do go work in industry, no matter like, I guess where we end up and be it like some high performing sort of industry, do you have any advice that you could give us about like working in that role? Like, how do I learn the most from that role, or how do I get the most from it? Yeah, really broad question.
So it's a good question. It's a loaded question because I think, you know, sort of the determinant of getting the most out of a role, I think ultimately is not, you know, your peers, it's not your parents, you know, it's not, you know, LinkedIn, you know, whatever. I think it's you guys, right? So I think we have to determine for ourselves, like, what are our metrics for success and what are our metrics for impact, right? So I think that those are sort of things that I would say, you know, I think the traditional school of thought is a lot of people, I think, don't know what they're going to be really good. So I always challenge you guys and all my students, right? And I've kind of spoken to probably, I guess, 50 schools. I've probably spoken to like 10,000 students over the last year. I think the number one advice I'd probably give you guys is kind of be on that quest a little bit in your 20s or 30s to find those things that you're actually uniquely good at. And what I mean by that is like, don't just go into banking because everyone's, I mean, you can go into, and I'll give you the reasons why maybe you should, but, you know, kind of try to figure out for yourself, what are things that you're uniquely good at, and use that as sort of a barometer to then just kind of work on that, right? So, because what I've realized over my career, albeit in my 20s, is that like the people that are really good at something and actually make a name for themselves, be it in consulting, be it in operations, be it in investment, be it in entrepreneurship, are people that are like, hey, this is actually aligned with my strengths. And I think the people that are able to recognize that earlier on are able to do a much better job in their careers. On the flip side, I've talked to a lot of MBAs who, you know, are much later in their career, mid 30s and whatever, and they're still trying to figure stuff out. So I would just say kind of challenge yourself to get that sort of introspection. That's number one. Number two, I think, is if you don't know, right? If you're like, hey, I have no idea. You spent all of college, you got a bunch of internships, you still don't know. Go into the most challenging sort of best job you can get into and then figure it out then, right? So the first job you get, I always say this, isn't the last job by any means. In fact, just like getting into Berkeley isn't the end all be all, as you guys have realized by now. I think there's just what are the steps of your own journey. And so I would say, like, if you don't know, or if you're still trying to figure it out, I would say try to apply to the best job that you can, and then define for yourself what success means, right? So do you think it's like in a matter of a year, I'll get to work on X, Y, and Z things, or in a matter of a year, I'm leading this, or I'm getting promoted, or I'm doing this, and more importantly, am I working towards kind of the goals that I want to work towards? A lot of people, though, I think all that said, I think still feel the need for credentialization to an extent as well, which I think is important because, you know, for the way society is set up, right? Where you work matters, what you do matters, maybe where you went to school matters, all those things. So it's sort of a healthy mix of all those things. But at the end, you sort of have to determine, I think college is sort of the end of the road where I think you have a path laid out for you. After that, it's a little bit of like, we have to start figuring out for ourselves what that path, and the best way to determine that path is for yourself, figuring out what you're really uniquely good at and how you define impact, right? For some people, it's like, hey, I want to become partner at Goldman Sachs by the time I'm 35. Great. That's important to you. Go for it. For some people, it's like, hey, I want to, you know, start my own entrepreneurial venture that's tackling, you know, mobility. Great. Like that's what's true to you, right? So all these experiences help you build those skills and you towards that goal. And number two, it gives you the relationships. At the end of the day, the business world is all about relationships. So the more people you know, the better you know them. It's kind of all that matters. So that's why I think going to some of these places is important, is to build that experience and build that relationships and build that sort of network. But beyond that, I would kind of challenge you over your 20s and 30s to, I think, figure out for yourself what that looks like. If you think, like, define success for yourself in that sense. I know track. So more tactically, like, go work in great firms with challenging people and challenging problems. And I think it'll start becoming more, you start going through that. Okay, cool. What else?
So how are, at least in terms of time, we have, I think, 4 minutes only scheduled left. Do you have to run after this, or are you able to just stay a few minutes
so
after?
I'm postponed the next meeting I have, so I've got a few more times, a little bit more
Okay.
time. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. So we have quite a bit of questions actually, so I think we can just go from those and answer those.
Is there like a separate Slack group? Is that what's going on?
No, I'm just doing it based on who has their hands raised in the participants tab.
Cool. No worries.
Yeah. So
Yeah,
David.
So whoever has a question, like I definitely think should ask them.
Yeah, David, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, thank you. So I kind of had a geographical question about the job market. I know a lot of finance is based in like New York, and people are like, you know, you want a lot of opportunity. People move to New York or San Francisco. What do you think about like the job market in places like, let's say, Los Angeles or other big cities that aren't really known for finance? And do you think people that want to base there and maybe live there and don't want to move to other cities, do you think there's the same opportunities, or just what's your perspective on that?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's a really good question. So I think to repeat, like, what are the differences? I'll give you some of my thoughts. I think like I tend to be a little bit more New York biased just because I've spent 8 years there. But I think generally, here are my thoughts, right? It's a little bit of a supply demand question, right? There are more supply of finance jobs in New York. Therefore, by definition, I guess there's more demand for jobs in New York. Look, I think if you start thinking about it, I would kind of say if you think of the world of finance, I would say New York is still the hub. We'll see what happens post-COVID, but I kind of still think in terms of the most concentration of certain jobs there. I think there's a few different reasons that might be the case. A lot of people start their careers off sort of working in New York for your first 2 to 3 years is more than working at an investment bank or a private equity fund. It's sort of like living in New York. It's meeting all the people in New York, like that type of thing. And that's some of the reasons behind why that cachet exists. Obviously, we're living in a time now where a lot of most of my analysts who are now starting full-time at a lot of these banks from Elevate are all doing it remotely, right? So, I've had networking sessions with all of them the last month. I think we're all kind of doing it remotely. So take that for what it's worth. Your specific questions on, markets like Los Angeles or Chicago, or Houston, where there's a little bit more, a little bit smaller. I think, look, if there's a strong reason you want to go there, either you're from Southern California or you're genuinely interested in media and, sort of that type of industry, or a lot of restructuring shops have offices in LA. I think if you can make a case for why LA, I absolutely think you have as good a shot as any, if not more, in some of those regional offices as you would, sort of the New York, San Francisco's, just because there's so many more people and it's a little bit harder to stand out. So I would say there's a fewer spots in some of those offices, but at the same time, I think you have a little bit better of a shot to stand out. Understand though that there are, if you think at a holistic level, if you want to stay in LA for the next 10, 15 years, great. You should absolutely focus on LA and California, just because if you want to be there. But there are some trade-offs, right? Like if you're looking at traditional exit options, there's going to be fewer ones. There's great firms in LA, right? One of my, panelists is, or one of the professionals who's teaching the Elevate stuff was at Goldman, was then at Blackstone, so New York, went to HBS, but now is a principal at Ares, which is an LA-based firm, and they just raised $4 billion in distressed credit. So there's a ton of opportunity in LA, right? There's kind of stuff that they do. People love LA for the lifestyle, so I don't blame them. I think if that is your question was LA focused, so I'll kind of answer it that way. If there's a reason you can make that case, I actually think you have a better shot of going to an office like LA than you might New York. Does that make sense? Is there I don't know if you have a follow-up to that.
No, I get that. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's see. Lucy, do you have a question?
Yep. Thank you, Pallav. Hi, Kajik. Thank you so much for speaking with us today. Really appreciate your time. So I just have a question. So for college students, we have the peer pressure, especially at Berkeley, right? And seeing my peers in BIG are all super successful. We all want to break into kind of the top tier job like banking. But from your personal experiences, you have worked 8 years in Goldman and then also had a few years in PE. What led to the transition of kind of start your own, Elevate Academy, and what were some of the difficulties that you faced or encountered?
Yeah, so a good question. I did want to point you guys to a ton of the resources that you asked. So I sent a link along. So a lot of people have pinged about hey, some of these conversations with professionals and stuff. So there's this separate advice database portal that we'll give you guys access to later. But for now, if you're interested in certain of these careers, I sent a link along where those are just conversations that I've had with different people digging into some of these careers in PE, banking, VC at some of the top firms in the world. So I think, to the extent that you guys are interested, I think the question around, my own kind of career journey, I think, Lucy, to your question, as well as some of the things with Elevate. Look, I'm still investing, so I think that's not like something that's going to go away. I've just felt like there's a huge need as I think about impact, as well as sort of the next few years of my career. I've been very fortunate to kind of get to some of the milestones that I've had in my 20s, but it was very focused, right? It was like, okay, how do I get to be, I wasn't necessarily planning that I'd be director in private equity by the time I was 30, because that's not how you plan for stuff. But I was like, hey, I want to be at that level by the time I'm XYZ. I felt like as I look back, the last 8 years have been very kind of internally focused. Like, hey, how do I just kind of make this, make that, make that? But I think for the next 5 years, I think what I'm trying to build with Elevate is sort of this, what are the next 5 to 10 years? Can we create this sort of best in class, like one of its kind platform and community network for kind of high achievers like yourself you guys to help connect and sort of pay this forward for the next generation. So that's sort of some of the motivations for me starting with Elevate. I also think in the finance world, like for some reason, just there's so much like black box nature that people don't love. Like, I don't think you'll ever find anyone who's going to go on a YouTube recording and talk about their experience at KKR. They did it for me, but I just don't think people do that. You know what I mean? So my point is, like, I want to break through some of that, like, oh, it's a very like elitist, it's a very accessible. Like, I came from a non-target background. You know, moved to this country when I was, when I was in middle school. So I had no business being in Wall Street to begin with. So my point is, the question that you raised, like, it's sort of kind of what you make of yourself. So that's what I see with Elevate is, can we just open the doors to a lot of these things that I think a lot of people are sort of afraid to talk about in some sense. And so that's number one. I think the number two, I think your question on this whole peer pressure thing, I totally get it. Unfortunately, look, I think the world is set up such that, like, if you want to go to like the best school, you have to get the best GPA in high school. If you want to get the best job, you get the best GPA in college. If you want to get the best business school, you have to get the best experience. I think there's some validity to that, because I think like people do acknowledge and / judge people based on those experiences. But at some point, I think we start thinking about things a little bit beyond that. And for you, I think, for you guys, I would still say in your 20s, like, work as hard as you can at like the best places that you can, unless you have this overarching need that I want to go do something, whatever. But I think then start like listening to yourself as to like, what are things that interest you, excite you, etc., and then start doing. That's not my only point. My point is to go and challenge yourself, etc. But don't do it from a sense of, hey, everyone else is doing it. Is that the reason I should do it? But I think it's more of like, hey, is this the right decision for me? That'll make you be more successful. It's just the nature of the world, especially in finance, to be competitive. So I think there's a little bit of element there, but also try to step away from that a little bit and do things that are better for you. Because I think the one thing that happened in this last recruiting cycle, whereas in years past, like 70-80% of investment banking analysts would go into private equity, more like 50% went off cycle. They didn't go into private equity because it was too soon. So I think a little bit of that's happening where a lot more people are thinking about venture capital. A lot of people think about entrepreneurship. So sort of break away from that mold a little bit. When you're ready for it, obviously, you should be working in challenging jobs. You should be like, these jobs are also very attractive because they pay a lot and you get a lot of really good experiences. So I think you should factor all those in. Just do it for the right reasons, I think, is what I would say.
For sure. Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing.
Of course. You got it.
Just on that point, there were a few people who I was talking to in BIG before this meeting, and we kind of hear a lot about the experiences about kind of people going into investment banking at the analyst level and then doing either on-cycle or off-cycle recruiting to private equity. But in terms of the structure of once you're, say, an analyst or an associate working at an investment bank, how does the promotion process within like that specific bank work? And I guess does it follow a structured timeline, or is it more, I guess, performance based?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it depends on the bank a little bit. Most banks either have a 2 or a lot of people have 3 years now. So where there's a GS, for instance, is 2 years as an analyst, and then you get an analyst +1, where you get to go do a rotational as an associate somewhere else and then come back to your original group. So each bank is different. Structurally, it's set up that I would say 25 to 30%, maybe a little bit more these days. So 40 to 50% of the analysts get promoted, both because 50% of the analysts end up leaving the firm to go to the buy side, or because, it's just, there isn't as many associate spots because we get associates from the MBA side and all these other things, right? So I think, I would say it's structured in a way where I'd say roughly half of the people even have spots as an associate. And I think really your job, I think your first couple of years should be like, figure out if you really want to be in banking long-term, and that's kind of where I would take the associate role, or you want to look elsewhere. To your question on cycle, off cycle, a lot of people, this year it's not happened yet, but I think last year it happened very early as far as on-cycle recruiting, and you guys can catch up with some of this on some of the academy stuff, but also some of the panels that we're going to have later. I would say that piece is something you have to, I think, start diligencing maybe your senior year of college, right? That's the difference, right? You have to start thinking about, is PE, VC the right thing for me? And if it is, be ready when it launches if you want to go through that, or you can wait a year and go through that, or you can, kind of stay on to be an associate. The way it works in banking is you start as an analyst, then if you get promoted to associate, again, every bank is different, but let's say in 2 to 3 years you get to do that, you basically just have to voice your interest saying, hey, I think I'm going to stay on and be an associate, and you talk to your partners and make sure that your performance is up to par. But assuming your performance is good and you want to stay, we'll find opportunities for you to get promoted. Then you stay on as an associate for probably, I guess, 3.5 years, and then you get promoted to vice president and then sort of director. So I kind of think of that as a pathway, to that front. I haven't gotten to some of the stuff on sort of the resume development. I don't know if a lot of you guys are in that thing, but there's kind of stuff I typically in the past have covered on networking, resume development, interviews and stuff, but we can do that another time. And folks are interested, you could reach out and I'm happy to answer any questions. But I think we're at 8 past. I'll take maybe one more question. I think Paula, you wanted a hard stop at 7:10. That works for me.
Yeah.
And yeah, feel free to, I just got like 20 stuff on LinkedIn. So if we didn't cover anything, guys, I will try to get to the LinkedIn stuff and answer it when I can, probably over the next couple of days.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you so much for that. And thanks for helping everyone out with that.
Yeah, no
last question we can take from Kevin.
Sure.
Okay, thank you so much. Yeah, before I even get to the question, I just wanted to say like thank you so much for all these like amazing answers. Like honestly, it like makes me excited how great your answers are. So thank you for that. In terms of the actual question itself, so I think you mentioned a little bit earlier about like understanding, like picking a path earlier on and kind of going really hard at it, and how you should understand like the differences between like sell side and buy side. And you had like a bunch of advice that you wanted to give. So I guess I wanted to hear that, like how you discover like what path you really should take.
Yeah, so the biggest difference I would say between like buy side and sell side, just because that's a question, is you have to figure out I would say 2 things. One is on the sell side, you're an advisor, right? So as you go on through your career, you are more of a client service advisor, where clients across the board hire you to provide advice on, IPOs, M&A, growth, restructuring, whatever. So that's the role of an investment banker. So if you kind of think about it, you're solving those types of challenging problems for clients, but you're doing an advisory capacity. So you get a breadth of experiences. So let's say you're a technology banker, right? You get to do the IPO of Uber while also doing the TikTok transaction, right? So I think you kind of get to see a lot of different deals. Then flip over to kind of the buy side stuff. Now you're responsible for investing in companies. Let's just take the private. I'll get back to the public in a second. But if you're looking at the private side of the world, you are spending a lot more time diving deep into an industry or a company because you now are an owner, right? So now you are an operator, you are an owner, as well as all like the financial stuff. So I would always characterize the banking side as you go up more and more higher, you have to sort of develop that trusted relationship with an advisor. You have to really understand finance and really understand the deal dynamics, and you become sort of a deal tactician as much as you do kind of the nitty-gritty of finance. And it's much more finance focused, and strategy focused. Whereas on the buy side, on the PE side, you're much more of an operator, you're much more of an investor. So you kind of are taking a view that, forget this company. Is this an industry that I want to be in? Is self-driving cars like an industry I want to actually be in? Thus, should I invest in cars? Should I invest in chargers? Should I invest in, some part of that value chain that's going to give me that outsized return? So there you're a little bit more of an operator as well as an investor. So it's a little bit more a combination of finance and sort of strategy. The public side, I don't think we'll get to here. It's a whole different ballgame, right? So public investing, sort of the hedge fund land, is much more around your understanding of public markets and what makes them move. So at the end of the day, it's like how deep you want to go within a company. What do you want the nature of the work to be? And are you kind of more thinking about things as an owner, or are you more like thinking of things as an advisor? And there's kind of pros and cons to both. That ultimately comes to you. Where are you better fit for? Where are you better at? Some people I know are terrible investment bankers, but amazing investors. And some people I know that are terrible investors, but amazing investment bankers. So you'd rather be really good at that. And kind of, so that's kind of what you guys are trying to figure out. Yeah, so that's kind of how I'd summarize probably the differences between the buy side and the sell side.
Thank you so much. That was an amazing answer again.
Well, cool guys. Well, it was really good to meet everyone. Thank you, Pallav and Shubham, for you guys for organizing it. I wish you the best of luck. I think we'll keep you guys and for everyone who's added their emails or connected on LinkedIn or Instagram or whatever, we'll try to keep you guys in the loop. And we will not try, but we will keep you in the loop as far as upcoming programming and stuff, so you can get engaged. If there are things you find interesting or you want to see more of, be like, hey, I like the speaker. Can you get more from VC? Whatever. We'll do our best to sort of get that. And if you want to help out with any of these sessions, let me know. We can try to get you plugged in. But I think the next thing I would just watch out for sort of these networking sessions where we're doing it across these different universities, as well as these panels in October. And I will send you guys info. I'm doing promos for all you guys, for all my partner schools, for all the training. So we'll send you info on that. Just take advantage. And there's like 90% of the resources online is free under Elevate. So just take advantage. And yeah, wish you guys the best of luck. And I'm sure we'll be collaborating a lot, going forward with Big. So good luck, guys.
Thank you so much, Kaushik. Really, really appreciate it. And I'll be sure to share any sort of emails or marketing materials that you send across.
I appreciate it. Awesome, guys. Look forward to it. Best of luck with COVID. And yeah, stay safe.
Right.
Thank you.
All right.